Modernity is marked by a number of philosophical shifts. Perhaps one of the most profound in the philosophy of language and metaphysics more generally is the final triumph of increasingly radical forms of nominalism. Unlike realism, which held that there was a metaphysical, ontological connection between the sign, the signifier, and the signified, nominalism held that, at least in the individual relationship between a substance and the category to which it belonged, that such categories existed, well, in name only. Thus, while John Dee could be said to exist as an individual person, a substance, the general category of humanity to which he belonged only did so in name only. Hence the name of this position, nominalism, nameism. This position would become even more radical as modernity wore on, eventually with the position of Ferdinand de Saussure that the relation of the sign, the signifier, and the signified was absolutely arbitrary, thus utterly amputating any metaphysical connection between language and ontology. In the 16th century twilight of realism, one language held out as the most radical example of the realist position, the so-called Enochian language, or the angelic, or better, celestial speech revealed to Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly. Here the angel Gabriel tells us that, quote, every letter signifieth the member of the substance whereof it speaketh. Every word signifieth the quiddity of that substance. Thus here is a language in which language and metaphysics are fused into the most realist position imaginable, that language is being, and that being is that language, the very language God spoke, as being itself. I hope you'll join me in this third part of our series on the Enochian, or better, angelic language, as I explore the best understood example of that language, the Enochian calls. These are psalm-like texts of invocation meant to unlock the power of the Liber Loga, the book of the speech of God. This section of the language is famous for having grammar, phonetic rules, vocabulary, syntax, even morphology, virtually all the traits of a natural language, but taken to be of supernatural, even divine origin. Let's explore the Enochian language, or better, the celestial speech. If you're interested in magic, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism. You can even check out curated playlists on various topics. And if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube for free, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or with a one-time donation, or you could even use the nifty super thanks option just below the video. But now let's turn to the language of the angels, and perhaps of the divine, the celestial angelic speech. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. This episode is the third in a series of detailed analyses of the angelic or celestial speech revealed to Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly through their scrying sessions in the mid-1580s. And I want to extend another profound thanks to Father Aaron Leach for looking over this episode as well. I mean, his expertise on the celestial language was deeply helpful with keeping me on my P's and Q's, or really my X's and Y's, given that this whole thing is a bunch of damn grids. Make sure to check out his volumes that I'll mention near the conclusion of this study. They are the best, I think, in any language, celestial or otherwise. While this episode should be able to act as a standalone, it would probably be prudent to watch all three in order, as I'll be assuming a good bit of the first two episodes in this series. Now, if you want to catch up on those, feel free to check out the other two episodes in the playlist above. But let's summarize the previous two episodes. Dee and Kelly started their scrying sessions in the early 1580s, mostly receiving directions to construct Solomonic-like furniture and ritual objects as part of a system of astral magic, now generally referred to as the Heptarchic system. That's the earliest strata of the so-called Enochian sessions. With that system laid out, it proved to be a kind of propedeutic for a more profound revelation, and about a year into the sessions, the angels began to reveal a vast book of words and letters and grids in an hitherto unknown alphabet. This text was entitled Amzes Hargezes Harde, or the Liber Loga, and it was a collection of 49 folios in Semitic right-to-left order, the first of which contained a grid of 49 by 49 words on both sides of the folio, totaling about 4,800 words in the very language of the angels. In fact, the very language God used to speak reality into being, followed further by more series of 48 folio grids containing letters and occasionally numbers, with a final grid representing the chaos of the apocalyptic last days. This was a string of 105 characters set into 5 tables of 21 letters each. Yeah, so how are these tables supposed to be used? It appears that after copying them all out correctly, they are somehow unlocked or opened using a series of 48 or 49 calls of psalm-like texts written in the angelic language, along with the complex ritual furniture described earlier in the Heptarchic system, starting with the second table, reveal that the first table is sealed for the Christ God, and the first angelic call, along with the famous prayer of Enoch revealed by the angel Ave. Now, to what end isn't exactly clear, but it either corresponds or possibly even prompts the apocalypse, or perhaps a kind of personal divine revelation. There's debate among modern occultists. If you're confused, good job. That means that honesty is a virtue that you can rightly claim. And if you want to get even more confused, I've covered the Liber Loga at length in the second episode of this series, but in this episode, I want to turn to those 48 angelic keys, or Enochian calls, and the language contained within them. About a year from the first revelations of the angelic language in the Liber Loga, a hitherto unknown angel known as Nauvaj appears and begins the painstaking process of revealing the keys that are said to unlock the grids revealed the year previously. Now, one would think that at this point, Dee would have finished completing the ritual volume of the Amzes Hargezes Harde meant to be unlocked by the keys, but there isn't much evidence to that effect. It may have been lost, or he may have never done it. In fact, there isn't much evidence that Dee and Kelly ever tried to put this vast system, or systems, I think, really, of magic into functioning order, with key aspects of its nature still mysterious down to this very day. But Nauvaj appears in April of 1584, and the revelation of the keys begins in fits and starts before diving into the painstaking detail of the first few keys. But before the first few keys are revealed, Nauvaj appears before yet another vast, indeed infinite, grid of angelic letters before zooming in on a very specific section. That section is slowly revealed to be a fourfold division of cosmic time. This is in contrast to the more standard threefold division developed by Joachim of Fior. This fourfold division is the pre-deluge period to the post-deluge period to Christ, post-crucifixion till now, and then tribulation till final glory. What's important about this text, called the Corpus Omnium, or the true body of things as Nauvaj has it, is that each portion of time and their peripheries on the table are denoted by words in the celestial speech, which are actually glossed into English. These words, aside from the precious few words glossed from the Liber Loga, represent some of the very first systematic words, even sentences, in the celestial speech. A few days later, an even stranger revelation is made, perhaps the single most mysteriously endearing revelation about or in the angelic speech to be found in the entire Enochian record. Recall that the Enochian calls are meant to unlock the power of the tables of the Liber Loga, but also recall that the first table of the Liber Loga, the one composed of entire words, about 4,800 of them in the celestial speech, is sealed for the God Christ and can't be unlocked by human beings. Despite this, and unknown to Dee at the time, that first call is a direct call to God and is actually revealed at this point apparently by Nalvaj. Now, it being revealed doesn't make it clear how to use it, precisely because it was never meant to be used by human beings in the first place, probably. But this first key, somehow derived from the Corpus Omnium, or probably from the infinite table of which the Corpus Omnium is just a part, is composed of long strings of textua continua, unlike the Liber Loci or the calls to come. Now, just what these strings mean, how they were meant to be used, or why they were even revealed in the first place, if they are indeed the call for the first unlockable first table of the Liber Loci, isn't at all clear. It's one of the many mysteries of the Enochian sessions. Regardless, the nature, meaning, and function of this string, again, is perhaps the most mysterious section of the angelic language, assuming that it's even part of the angelic speech at all. The next day, Friday, April 13th, 1584, the angel Nalvaj begins the revelation of the 48 keys of the Enochian calls. Kinda. The keys themselves, in both the celestial speech and their English senses, are actually revealed in starts and fits in various forms of transmission over the course of the next few months, finally ending on July 13th, 1584, with the call of the 30 Aethers. The reception of the keys or calls is positively tortured. The first 4 keys are revealed backwards and in reverse order over several sessions, with the English sense giving upon the completion of each key. Keys 5 through 18 were revealed in one completely haphazard breakneck session in forward order, though with each English sense of each provided in a later session. Though some of these keys were scrambled or missing words, the phonetic information to aid with pronunciation of these keys appears sometimes, and then sometimes it doesn't. The revelation of key 10 is just a mess. There are sections missing from other sections. Keys 14 and 15 are just missing from the revelations in the autograph of Cotton Appendix number 1, but they are found in Sloan 3191 or the Claves Angelicae, the fair copy upon which most editions of the keys are now based. If you're a fan of Enochian magic and you've only ever seen a fair copy of the Enochian keys, I dare you, I double dog dare you to work through the entirety of their revelation in the Cotton Appendix. You're going to alternatively need whiskey and espresso for that roller coaster, and have fun and good luck with your sanity. But, in brief, the first 4 keys are transmitted backwards in reverse order, seemingly by Nalvaj finding the letters in yet more vast tables, presumably the tables of the Liber Loci, or maybe the infinite table of which the Corpus Omnium was extracted. Though the letter locations sometimes vastly outnumber the size of those tables, except for the infinite one, with movements of tens of thousands of spaces, sometimes nearly 200,000 spaces to arrive a single letter. Further, the numbers themselves are somehow ontologically tied with the letters they represent. In fact, it seems that the angels had been reading their Pico, the Kabbalistic conclusions, when we hear that Gabriel informs us that the numbers that we speak of are of reason and form. They're formal numbers and not those of the merchants. That idea of formal numbers comes directly from Pico's Kabbalistic conclusions and is put directly into Dee's Monas Hieroglyphica before finally here ending up in the mouth of the angel Gabriel. In fact, one such example of angelic quasi-gematria is kind of a detour into the revelation of the word vo'an in the first key, the word for truth, and the locational values are at one point called a mystical root, and then they're called the square of the philosopher's work, which confuses Dee, ever the careful mathematician. The angels, perhaps red-faced, confusing squares and roots, just split the difference and tell Dee it's a square root. To me, one of the most comical sections of the angel diaries, even more than when they mess up their Latin or go looking for treasure. I mean, whoever said angels had to be good at math, maybe they were liberal arts majors. Of course, nothing is as funny as the buried treasure escapades, and yes, those escapades are going to get their own episode at some point. You know that I love the giant buried treasure detour that is in the Angelic Diaries. Regardless, the unitive link of numbers, letters, and ontology are perfectly at home in this twilight of radical realism, though I suspect that the large, inexplicable numbers here could just as well be Kelly using them as subterfuge to hide his, let's call it celestial cribbing. Regardless, just as with the painstaking revelation of the Liber Loga, the process of the revelation of the keys would eventually be expedited to forward order, with Kelly apparently fluently speaking in the angelic language during his trance states, with the English sense provided later. So what are these keys? What are the Enochian calls? Briefly, they are psalm-like texts of apocalyptic divine pronouncements and angelic quasi-invocations. They range in length from the 30th being about 180 words to the shortest, the 15th, hardly even 30. Really only about 19 if you don't include the final refrain, move and show yourselves, open the mysteries of your creation and be friendly unto me, for I am the servant of your God, the true worshipper of the highest, which is actually appended to calls 11 through 18 by angelic command for various reasons. The calls, because of their brevity and utter strangeness, are highly resistant to summary, so I'm not even going to attempt to summarize them here. They're best just to read, and considering that in total they're only a couple thousand words, it takes only about 10 or 15 minutes to read them all, not that reading them will make anything clearer to you. Though recall my introduction to the episode, these keys, like the Liber Loga, are exercises in radical linguistic realism, such that each letter signifieth the member of the substance whereof it speaketh. Each word signifieth the quiddity of that substance. This is the kind of thing you might hear in Duns Scotus. But just as the Liber Loga is somehow thought to be reality itself in alphanumeric form, the keys are said to be the life of motion which animates pure being into becoming. They are what activates the pure potential of the tables of the Liber Loga as per pretty classic medieval Aristotelian physics. Further, the calls are said to touch on all parts of the world, with which you can do anything, thus connecting them to the later parts of the world revelations in which the entire magical system can be used as a kind of remote viewing platform and angelically powered international espionage. Yes, international espionage. Why isn't this a movie? I'm serious. Angelically powered international espionage using the language of creation, and you also kind of get the apocalypse there in the wings. You have Dee rebuking a sitting emperor because the angels basically told him to do it. And of course you have the wife swapping business later on. Hey, Robert Eggers, you got to get your people to call me. We gotta make this John Dee movie. Remote viewing aside, the calls are specifically required for opening the tables of the Liber Loga in the process of ascending or descending, as the Merkava tradition has it, from the Aether Lil down to the fourfold Aether of Tex, probably resulting in some kind of Gnostic-like experience of divine revelation. Of course, we don't know, at least not from the journals left by Dee and Kelly, because neither Dee nor Kelly ever seemed to complete the complex Jabofal or Gabofal ritual, so the jury's kind of out about what exactly all of this is supposed to do. We do learn a bit about the individual calls, at least some of them, often in kind of asides by the angels. For instance, we do get confirmation that call 1 is meant for table 2. Remember that table 1 is locked, though perhaps with the exception of that really weird string of letters by Nalvaj that we mentioned earlier. Further, call 1 invokes the kings and ministers of government, though this is perhaps a reference to celestial or planetary beings, but it could just as well be actual rulers on the earth. Again, this espionage business. Key 3 and perhaps the corresponding 4th table seem to be related to the incarnation of human beings into our physical bodies. The key of the 30 Aethers invokes the spirits of the air, which are typically identified as kind of quasi-demonic and meaning grimoires at this time. Recall that Cecco d'Ascoli was actually burned for this kind of astral necromancy, though the angel Nalvaj makes it clear that they are not rejected, but dignified. Again, calls 19 through 49 are all identical, except for the change of the name of the specific Aether in the first line of the invocation. Aside from these brief asides, we know very little as to the exact meaning of these calls. Filled with angels, directions, geometric angles, oddly specific numbers, and descriptions of apocalyptic violence, they remain as inspiring and frightening as they are poetic and alluring. So what can we say about the language of the calls? From a mathematical linguistic angle at least, the language of Table 1 of the Liber Loga and the calls are actually distinct, but not totally unrelated. Recall that the Liber Loga can slip into glossolalia-like strings of letters where the call language never appears to do that. Further, some words or word-like clusters from Liber Loga do seem to reappear in the calls, so they typically are very short words. Just what the relationship is between the two, if any, remains completely mysterious. The sample size of the call language is so small compared to that of the Liber Loga, in fact, much smaller. Table 1 of the Liber Loga contains about 4,800 words, while the call language is less than half that size, at about 1,070 words, and really only about 250 if you don't count the repetitions. As you can imagine, with a poverty of sample size, deriving any sure linguistic features from the calls is extremely challenging. That said, the call language does have apparent linguistic features, including non-random words, syntax, morphology, numerals, even hints at verb conjugations and noun declensions. In short, it appears language-like, but let's add a caveat. I really mean a mountain of caveats, obviously, but let's specify one here. The calls are never really translated into English in a word-to-word analytic form. Rather, they are given an English sense by the angels. In fact, this sense is responsible for the interpolation of many adjectives into the otherwise very adjective-poor language of the calls. But what more can we say about the linguistics of the Enochian language? Phonologically speaking, the language appears quite similar to early modern English. Like the language of the Liber Loga, it doesn't seem to betray any sounds outside of that very specific phonemic range. While there are unusual consonant and vowel clusters, at least when compared to English, many of those are pretty adequately described by the phonetic clues left in the diaries by Dee. Of course, any phonological study of the celestial speech as it's preserved in Dee's early modern English would need to be placed into that context of pronunciation, and especially that all of this is actually happening in the midst of the great vowel shift. Generally speaking, the language seems to be based on a collection of very brief roots, which are mutated with pre, post, and infixes to provide grammatical structure and thus meaning, though admittedly the rules of these mutations are poorly understood if they can be really said to exist at all. Some of those roots have their origins in other English, Latin, Greek, and sometimes even Hebrew words. The nature of the mutations of nouns and verbs don't seem to follow any apparent patterns, although elements of declension and conjugation might be present, and there appears to be a pretty strong case that the vocative is actually used in the Enochian language. While some range of nouns, verbs, and numerals are known, adjectives are actually rather poorly attested, as I mentioned earlier. However, compound words are attested and even employ elision in their formation. The celestial speech seems to be pro-drop, like Latin, and while personal pronouns and prepositions are attested, they're actually pretty rarely in use. The syntax is generally SVO, subject, verb, object, like in English, and the numerical system is a complete mystery. The first 10 numbers are attested, sometimes with various forms for each number. Further numbers from 12, 1,000, 8,763. Some huge numbers are even attested, and there seems to be some one-to-one correspondence of celestial letters to Arabic numerals, but it isn't understood in the least. Even numbers like 1,000, 9,996, or 3,663, they don't seem to even track to Arabic numerals to Enochian letters in any comprehensible sense. Thus, Enochian numerals remain a complete mystery, and as Leach pointed out to me in private correspondence, any attempt at Enochian gematria is doomed to fail on this regard. Generally speaking, the small sample size, the semi-random mutations, and the apparent root system of the celestial speech work as both a bug and a feature of the language. A bug in that the most we can gather about the language are taken from such small sample sizes as to make them indistinguishable from simply chance changes or occurrences. Further, it also may be a bug of the angelic language that so many of the words are apparently derived from other languages like English, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. But if you take an angelic priority for the origins of all the languages, then that problem conveniently goes away. Though if you know anything about contemporary linguistics, you can't as easily just accept that angelic priority as Dee probably did, and you're left with some serious questions about how these words got built into Enochian. Though all that might play as a feature as well. The language is just non-random enough, and given Kelly, an obvious non-linguist, the dude's not Tolkien, as a medium for this thing, perhaps non-random enough to think that something beyond him is ultimately responsible for the revelation of the celestial speech. Now, it could also just as well be a con job by Edward. I had my ears cut off for previous con jobs, Talbot. Oh, I mean Kelly, as an exercise in conning Dee. It could also be an odd exercise in cryptography, a la Trithemius, or something altogether more complex. In fact, I'm on team altogether more complex, if that matters to anyone out there. Of course, the revelation of the calls in 1584 would be by no means the final revelation from Dee and Kelly's angels. In the midst of the revelation of the calls and the call of the 30 Aethers would appear the parts of the Earth revelation, all an aspect of the ability of the Magus to use the system to remote view and perhaps even influence the various regions of the Earth. Clearly an interest to Dee. I mean, this is the guy that coined the phrase, the British Empire, and was deeply involved in espionage. Later would appear the system that we now call the Watchtowers, though as Dee thought they were reaching the apex of these increasingly apocalyptic sessions, Kelly was seeking to get out of it all. And he'd do so. He'd find work as an alchemist in the Holy Roman Empire, which provided him with title and lands, Sir Edward Kelly, before dooming him to prison, and ultimately an escape attempt from that prison cost him his life. Dee would return to an England eventually ruled over by James I, whose intolerance of anything magical was legendary, though apparently the Ingle-Navage actually looked a bit like James I. His library and scientific equipment were all looted upon his return home to Mortlake. He would live the rest of his life under a meager pension and the constant state of being accused of being a sorcerer, something you don't want in the Witchcraft Act of 1604. Of course, this wouldn't stop his desire to discover radical truths through angel scrying, though nearly all of his sessions with Bartholomew Hickman, which meant many more years than the Kelly sessions, were all destroyed and lost. I suppose that to the very end, Dee could hear that final angelic utterance somewhere deep in his being. Open the mysteries of your creation and make us partakers of undefiled knowledge. The classic Daniel Laycock Enochian Dictionary remains a pretty helpful volume in the study of the celestial language, and it was actually one of the first esotericism-related purchases that I ever made. I think it was like 14 at the time. The calls themselves can be viewed in Cotton Appendix number 1, along with a fair copy in Kelly's hand in Sloan 3191. Of course, the most comprehensive study of the angelic, celestial, or Enochian languages and the Jabofal or Gabofal ritual to unlock it is Father Aaron Leach's 2-volume work on this topic. In fact, this episode would have been virtually impossible without his wonderful scholarship and insight. Again, I'd really like to thank him for looking over this work, and I'd also really recommend ordering his books from his website where you can get them signed, and he gets a more direct cut of the profits. I mean, look guys, these occult writers are not making a ton of money, and trust me, folks publishing books like these are doing it out of a labors of love, and supporting them is something we can all do. Make sure to support your small independent publishers and independent authors. Of course, this episode won't be the end of John Dee and the Enochian material, so I hope you'll join me for more Enochiana in the future. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.